Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. For those who don't know me, I'm Richard Harriott, and I'm the chairman of the Ove Arup Foundation, which is sponsoring tonight's event here at the Guardian. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening and to thank you for joining us, whether you're joining us here in the Guardian's offices or you're joining us online. Thank you very much. And it's a particular pleasure for me to welcome our four guest speakers who've given up their time and their expertise to come and stimulate some of the debate. We're very grateful to you. Philip Inman, who's the economics correspondent of The Guardian, will be chairing this evening's processes, and he'll introduce our four guest speakers to you formally in just a moment. Why is this important to the Ove Arup Foundation? Well, our mission, or our purpose if you like, is to promote knowledge and education in the built environment. And we like to do that, especially if there is some emphasis on the interdisciplinary nature of design in engineering and architecture, and beyond those to economics, social sciences, politics, and so on. And tonight's debate is an important topic because new ideas for urban living are going to be crucial, arguably, if we want a long-term wealth and well-being for society as a whole, particularly when we hear that the world population is likely to increase in a relatively short space of time to 7 billion. And most of those will be living in an urban environment. And we're very confident that tonight's debate will produce some new ideas. And we very much hope that those ideas will actually lead to some actions and some outcomes, whether they're in teaching, research, governance, regulation, whatever, or just in the way people think and behave in planning and living in urban environments. And we're particularly grateful to The Guardian for hosting us here in their offices in London, and for the enthusiastic support that they have given the whole of this process, and for their very much their hard work and their expertise, particularly of course in media links and the whole media expertise. It's very, very amazing for someone like me to see it. It's terrific. And finally, I want to thank in advance, I hope it's wise, Philip, I want to thank Philip Inman for agreeing to chair the processes this evening. We're very grateful to that, to you for that, Philip. And so once again, thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoy it. Philip Inman.
Thank you very much, Richard. Well, on behalf of the panel, I'd like to welcome you all this evening. Before we get going, I have a few sort of housekeeping rules. If the fire alarm goes off, you could all leave by the exits at the back and the front. There are stairs going straight out. The ones you've just come up will be the ones that you'll use to go out. There are also various signs around for exits to the outside world. Now, this evening we are being filmed. This is being live streamed, and we will be having contributors from outside this room. People looking in on what we're saying, what we're doing, and they will also participate in the debate. They'll be using the GDN Urban Living hashtag you see up there to contribute, and I'll be passed at various parts of the evening when we get into our debate some of the contributions that we're going to get from those from people. And you can do it yourself as well as putting your hand up. You can also, usually at these sort of events I ask everyone to switch their mobile phones off, but that's not the case now. If you just have them on silence, that would be great. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guests. First up will be Jeff Mulligan, who's the Chief Executive of the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, commonly known as NESTA. known for his time as an advisor to the last government and as a founder of the think tank Demos, Jeff has strong views which we're going to hear on urban living, which I'm sure we're going to have from everybody. Alec Burrows, Lord Burrows, Chairman of Bio Nano Consulting, is the former Vice Chancellor of the University of Cambridge and was President of the Royal Academy of Engineering from 2001 to 2006. I used to write about computers, and I remember as not about IBM, when you were at IBM for a very long time.
You never leave.
And he knows all about how technology can support modern urban living. Pam, who's sitting on my right, Pam Alexander, is currently a trustee of the Design Council and the director of the Academy of Urbanism. She was chief executive of the South East England Development Agency. As we know, development agencies have gone by the board, where she championed sustainable economic growth from Milton Keynes to the Isle of Wight and across to Kent, and she's been at the sharp end of many big developments, particularly Thames Gateway and in Ashford. And lastly, but not least, Kevin MacLeod, as you know, broadcaster on Channel 4. He has his own company, HAB Housing, which he describes on his blog as a residential development company building highly sustainable homes with innovative technology, car clubs and zero carbon objectives. I'm sure we're going to hear more about that. Jeff, can I ask you to kick off?
Okay. Good evening. I think in many of the papers this morning, including The Guardian, we were told that house building is now at the lowest level since records began. So maybe we should be talking about whether there will be any urban development rather than the quality of it. But I'm going to focus on the quality question. And it strikes me that everybody, and everyone in this room certainly, knows what a living place looks like, a place which is dynamic, exciting, sort of full of vigour, and we know what the opposite looks like. And we've had several thousand years of urban development to try some things out, some successes, some failures. Given that, why are so many central business districts utterly soulless and dead? Why are big new developments like Songdo in Korea apparently designed more for robots than for human beings? Why, in one of the biggest recent German developments, did the local paper say there was more life in the local cemeteries than in what they'd just built? Why are so many of the Chinese cities being built in ways which almost guarantee that they will be unloved, unlivable in really quite a short period of time, breaking almost all the lessons which have been learnt from the many failed developments of the West? What intrigues me is what we have learnt about what makes places both beautiful but also livable and lovable. And some of those lessons are about physical design, they're about things like lines of sight, about how you mix up the very public, the semi-public, and the private spaces. Some of them are about how you use water or nature and trees to make people feel at home. And a lot of them are about incompleteness, how you design in ways which let the people who will live in the places complete them in their own way, rather than totally finished plans. Increasingly, we're also seeing woven into this how you use technologies, the Internet of Things, mobile, Wi-Fi and so on, as almost an integral part of the physical environment. But the strange thing is how little of that kind of knowledge is actually orchestrated or easily available compared to the knowledge about how you finance buildings or the knowledge about how you make them energy efficient. And as a result, mistakes are continually made and remade in ways they're not made quite as badly on the other fronts. So what interests me in the next few years is how we get to a different way of thinking about two things, really. One is what should be the interaction of, as it were, the top-down plans of powerful people with money, developers, architects, planners, on the one hand, and the people who are constantly remaking cities from the ground up, the people who are making cities edible. Urban farming is absolutely everywhere at the moment. Or the people from the arts or digital media who take over parts of cities, pull them apart, recombine them in ways that the planners could never have imagined. Or the people rethinking about how cities should work for lives of 100 or 110 years, where our abilities, our physical abilities, will constantly change in our last few decades, requiring very different models of housing, transport and care. And the second thing which I think we need is something perhaps almost a new profession. We have very powerful professions in this room: construction, engineering, architecture, planning, and so on. But I wonder whether we don't need a different kind of profession which integrates that understanding of physical things and the much greater understanding the last 10 or 20 years of the energy and material aspects of physical design, to integrate that on the one hand with understanding the virtual world and the opportunities created by digital technologies, and thirdly, how you integrate that with understanding human beings. Sociology, psychology, understanding of dynamics, what makes people feel at home somewhere, what makes them feel they belong, and what makes them feel alienated. I don't think that's too much to ask, but it's still striking, even in the most imaginative and progressive sort of visions of new cities, the new towns like Hammarby or Vauban or Sonoma in California, they all feel like they haven't quite got that right. They haven't quite got the human element. They don't feel quite organic and living in the way that so many places, probably the places you choose to spend time on holiday and so on, that those places have. But I think if we can get this right, there is a great reward, not just in more livable and more lovable places, but actually, if we're blunt, also on asset values. They'll be worth more.
Thank you very much.
Well, I'm going to talk about prosaic technology things. That's what I know about. And what I'm going to talk about is really quite obvious, but then to me things like the iPod were obvious. When technology is ready for things, it's not a big step to understand what people would like and what we should do with technology. So I'm going to talk about that with respect to transport, or I prefer to call it mobility. Now I'm not a social scientist, but what I'm going to talk about does relate to social science. So when I get to that, you'll know I don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm going to do it anyway. Interestingly, we members of the Science and Technology Committee of the House of Lords are currently conducting an inquiry into science advice to government, and the first thing we've come across is there's quite a shortage, a paucity of advice from social scientists. We need far more advice from social scientists. Our committee had already discovered this when we were looking into behavioural issues such as smoking and obesity. I mean, this is not a technical matter, it's a social matter. But let me get back to the prosaic stuff. Let me talk about cars. And perhaps Kevin's going to talk about cars. I mentioned car clubs, but it mystifies me in today's world why people choose to spend hours sitting in their cars in traffic jams every day. I look down out of my flat in the Vauxhall, and I see these cars lined up every morning. And of course, there are many factors why people stick to their cars. First of all, there's usually no single transport system that will take them door to door. And they don't like walking, presumably, or it'll take too long. Public transport is too crowded, it's noisy, it's socially intrusive, and very often, because of the crowdedness, uncomfortable. It's not always predictably on time, or the timetable is inconvenient, and so on and so forth. They opt rather for the expensive option of driving themselves. Why? Well, because it's comfortable. In many cases, it is door to door. They can use their hopefully hands-free mobile phones. They can listen to their radio and quietly think about the day to come or the day that's past. I mean, overall, and most importantly, their journey is personalised and it's private. What they want and when they want it, in peace and quiet. So long, of course, that they are immune to road rage, which in London about 30% of drivers are, perhaps. So what can technology do to help their behaviour? Let me mention a few things. First, a low-tech solution that, for the fit and healthy, that helps to solve some of these problems, and that's bicycles. And we're doing brilliantly with bicycles. Boris's bicycles work very well. They've used technology very intelligently, and we should have more of them and do more. And a lot of people are going that way. It's a great success. But most importantly to me, they indicate what we might do with cars. Small electric cars, about a third of the size of our average car, that would be parked in high-density bespoke car parks where their batteries would be automatically charged, and these cars would be publicly owned, rather like Boris's bikes. You just borrow them for a while. Some people are exploring this around the world already. We could use them in cities, and we could have hundreds of them at commuter train stations. I go out to the Diamond Light Source a lot. Didcot Parkway would be a classic. They have a ramp of 200 small electric cars. They'd only have a range of 30 miles. They could only be plugged in and charged at the station. So you couldn't put the family in them and go to Edinburgh over the weekend. You'd buy them with your season ticket. And it could work. It could work very well. All the technology's there to do it. It's just a matter of organising it. They could be tracked, these bikes. So if everybody came over from Romania and tried to drive them home, first of all, they'd run out of gas before they got to Dover. And secondly, we'd know where they were, unlike the bikes that all disappeared out of Cambridge. In this way, we might get people to give up their second car, and in the city give up a car altogether, if they didn't have another reason. Now, let me finish a bit, then I'll go and talk about buses. Now, buses always come in threes when there's a lot of people around. And I won't get into the reason for that. Queuing theorists know all about it. Technology can go a long way to solving this problem. It's already possible, if we implemented it, to predict and measure load factors much more accurately and in real time as well. Technology is available to count people waiting at a bus station, either through their cell phones, believe you me, having been associated with Vodafone, we never talk about it, we know where everybody is. You could count the people at a bus station. You wanted to be more transparent, you could have a button that said 87, I want to have the 87 bus, and to take it even further, you could let the system know where you wanted to go. This combined with a wonderful asset we have that makes this very easy, which is the postcode. The postcode in this country really describes end-to-end unambiguously. Unlike Google at times. I mean, my hometown is Melbourne, Australia. I used Google to find a new deeds I had when I was a visiting professor at Monash just this year. And I found myself in a very strange place because I was going to a street called View Street. It turned out there were 11 of them in Melbourne. And some of them were very close. There's only one postcode that's very useful. Finally, now if we could have an all-encompassing system capable of advising people in real time about the various ways in which they can reach their destination, it would be a wonderful thing. The system would know of any delays due to accidents, equipment failure, or crowding. It will be able to predict the timing for the various alternatives and how loaded the vehicles were likely to be. There are internet websites already that do a lot of this based on known timetables and reported delays and failures. But in the future, the availability of up-to-date information on loading factors, combined with the ability of operators to react in real time to overcrowding, will yield huge improvements to that system. This will not only stop people, this, however, I'm going to say, will not stop people if they've just bought a brand new car and that's their pride and joy and they want to sit in it, but there are many who would be persuaded. They'd now have a system that they could look at immediately. They would not only be able to predict that their mode of transport was going to be on time, but they would be able to predict whether or not they could get a seat on it, if they were disabled or something. It would improve the entire system. All we need to do is join up the data systems. Now we say, oh, that's not going to be easy. It's something we're struggling with in the TSP transport network for transport, the knowledge transfer network. But the potential there is huge. We could have the entire thing joined up. you'd be able to know exactly when you were going to get somewhere and in what comfort you would have. That's my concept for what is almost certainly do if we can organise ourselves to do it.
Well, thank you very much, Andy. Thank you. I'd like to introduce Pam.
Thanks very much. Well, I want to talk about urban futures for people living in smaller towns, especially peripheral seaside towns, who could so easily miss out on the sort of futures that we talk about for cities. Where are their pathways to success? And I think education-led regeneration is an essential, if not sufficient, part of the answer to that question. The flight from historically low-skill, low-wage coastal economies to the cities, on your bike, traditionally denudes them of their most talented and motivated sons and daughters. We need to develop pathways for people, not in concrete but in opportunity, to invest in the people capital, which is the basis of social and economic capital. Many would-be students needing the individual support that comes with face-to-face learning will want to be based at home in future in order to save money. Yet many seaside towns are remote from a university. This is a real opportunity to plan new pathways of learning which could transform local aspirations by demonstrating that all sorts of success are possible here in my town. Every seaside town can be a university town, with a ladder of learning from the Sure Start Centre right up through improved schools and further education to higher education, shaped with and by local businesses throughout, rooting people to their hometowns, if that's where they want to be rooted. University centres are campuses of established universities joining up education streams and working closely with local businesses to offer three things that are a bit different from the mainstream offer. First of all, life-centred course structures, which are built around the fact that people may need to have a course that knows that they have childcare responsibilities, that they have jobs that they're doing at the same time. Secondly, a career-focused education from day one, supporting each student's investment in creating a better life for themselves. And thirdly, and very importantly, a professional and vocational focus with accredited courses which are linked into the local employer's identified needs and built with them, with industry experts involved in the teaching and in the course development, and with work experience a key part of every course. There are few examples of such a truly integrated pathway, and one is University Centre Hastings, where the University of Brighton has created new courses and support and worked with employers and with the new Further Education College to identify clear pathways, particularly for mature students, for care leavers and for caregivers, and for other people who are not on the motorway to higher education that is offered to many people with A-level results. The transformational impact that this has had on local families is really clear. When I met the first group of social science graduates from UCH, who were all mature women who had left school with no qualifications, no job, and no hope of ever having one, and with 4 or 5 children each by then, they were very rightly proud of the achievement that they had got. And they were set to train for social work and to go into further study. But much more inspiring for me, in just 3 years, their success had completely transformed the aspirations of their families, who had thought that qualifications were for other people. As one said, my teenage daughter just assumes she'll go to university because mum did. That's gold dust. Changing people's aspirations is what we all desperately try to do in these towns. The buzz of a university campus for 800 students, alongside a new FE college for 2,000, has also begun to transform the face of Hastings, with refurbished landmarked buildings open to the community, with top-class industry-standard training facilities, which new businesses are using too, and with staff who are active in business as well as in teaching. And there's been a significant cash injection into the local retail and new cafe economy. We've got a new major employer, Saga, bringing 800 jobs into the first privately financed, speculatively built offices in Hastings for decades. And the prestigious Jerwood Foundation has chosen Hastings for its new gallery, which opens in the spring to exhibit its permanent collection. Success in this requires investment in the whole student experience if people are going to feel rooted in their hometown. And that may scare the often conservative but characteristically edgy population of seaside towns. And that's where community planning must come into its own. And the academics can help people to understand the characteristics, the challenges and the opportunities of their town as the basis for planning in student accommodation, nightlife, and indeed the business support that creates a pathway that really leads to a new future. There's an enormous way to go. Hastings was the 19th most deprived borough in England in the 2010 survey, although a lot of the data was out of date by then. And there are new challenges too, with fees rising, capital funds cut and student numbers being redistributed. But education-led regeneration is a long-term plan, and we mustn't stop doing it just because of the problems. The energy and the results are there to see. 92% of graduates from UCH have found a job or moved on to new study within 6 months of leaving, and that's through the deepest recession that most of us have ever known. Rolled out across our coastal towns, university centres jointly planned with local communities and closely connected to support for local business growth will create transformational pathways for local people. They could mean that on your bike is the ride to college or work and not the ride out of town for good.
Well, thank you very much, Pam. And without further ado,
thank you, Philip. I'm the builder on the Brains Trust, and I have got some pictures. And I was about to ask. I don't know how I'm going to operate this, but I've now got the remote control operator. Is that right?
I can.
Or do you want me to come stand there?
It's up to you.
There's my head in the way.
It's kind of about
Thank you. So, which one is it? Just press that big one. Thank you. Right, so anyway, this is HAB. This is my development company, HAB Housing. I'm going to show you some pragmatic solutions to what we're trying to do at the moment, rather than talk about what we dream of, although the two are very, very closely connected. We build houses. This is a scheme that we've just completed in Swindon. We're building in Swindon, Stroud, Oxford, Chippenham, and one or two other places in the West Country, I hope. We have several hundred homes to build now. These houses here are designed by Glen House Associates. They're built out of hempcrete. They've got carbon into them. They're highly efficient buildings, and they're built to standard housing association budgets. That's about £108 a square foot, £1,080 a square metre, and for that we deliver code 4 houses with lots of extras. They have things like air source heat pumps, passive stack ventilation. They're very airtight. They're roomy. They've got high ceilings. They've got big windows. Light spills deep into the plan, and they're full of exciting technological and wonderful architectural ideas. You'd expect that, wouldn't you? Of course. They are eco homes. Eco homes are fairly straightforward to build. It's not difficult to make an eco home. It's quite difficult to make one for standard housing association budget. And when you built it, you move people in. And of course, the first thing they do is, as we all do in Britain, in order to control the heating and the environment in our houses, we turn our thermostats up to full, and then we control the temperature by opening the windows. So, we're not going to make ecological communities by simply building ecological homes. We believe and hold dear several principles, one of which is the principle of sharing. We all share lots of things. I mean, we share library books, we share meals, jokes, we share public transport, we share sexually transmitted diseases. We share a great number of things between us as human beings. And we don't, I mean, as Alec so rightly said, we do not share our cars. We do not share our private realm. We keep that to ourselves. But that is an elastic thing, which in many cultures moves about. And there are many cultures in which privately owned space becomes a shared space at different points in the day or week. And we believe that many more things could be shared, from power tools and sheds to public realm. We give our residents, whether they're owners or they're renters, we give them a shared ownership of the public realm. They share between them ownership of the kitchen garden, the polytunnels, the play space here, as you see, the benches, the community barbecue, the hand pump that pulls all the water up from the crated well below. And through that, we believe that gives them an increased sense of ownership of space, but also it helps reduce maintenance costs of schemes. In addition to that, we also believe in the value of green infrastructure. For most people, trees and grass is the fluff that gets added to schemes when they're finished. For us, they're almost the starting point. Green infrastructure, here, there are 3 willow trees planted into a swale. So what? The point about them is they're planted at the bottom of the swale. This is Luke Engelbach's work, who works with us. The water that feeds the swale comes off the roof of the houses. It comes into the swale, which eventually will be full of reeds and frogs and newts and wildflowers. And that swale will dry in summer, and in winter it will become boggy, and the children can come out and play in it, and they can enjoy the water, and the willows here will suck that water, relieving the pressure on the main system and on the infrastructure in the area. That also provides increased biodiversity. It also provides cooling, provides a microclimate around those trees. This is green, fluffy stuff, performing so much more, performing at many different levels, providing amenity, providing biodiversity, providing flood alleviation, providing microclimate, and it's just a tree. We believe, if you like, that the job of the landscape architect, maybe this answers Jeff's quest, I don't know, for this new discipline in urban realm design. We believe that landscape architecture, the public realm, the stuff that happens in between the buildings, is as important, if not more so, than the architecture itself in terms of creating social sustainability, car share clubs, electric bike share clubs, being able to let your kids cycle down the street because there's a local community enforced speed limit of 5 miles an hour. Letting your kids go out and play in the rain, in the water, because there is water to play in the street. Giving people a community garden and community growing facilities so that they can share ownership of that. Of course, there are tensions that emerge when instead of a thorn hedge between 2 houses, you plant an Espalier apple tree, because whose apples are they? This house is or the next? Well, the answer is they work it out. In fact, in this case, this is in Swindon, the community that moved into this scheme knew each other before they moved in. Partly thanks to the efforts of our partners, the housing association involved, partly thanks to Facebook, because they set up their own page. And finally, we're not just about community-grown cabbages and edible hedgerows, we're also about community technology as well. Apples of all kinds. This is a piece of technology we've developed. It's called the Shimmy, stands for it. It's a home information portal. It's an iPad which remains attached to the wall so your children can't steal it and run away to their bedrooms with it. This machine tells you how much energy you're using, how much water you're using, what your next bill will be, how much you're saving. It allows you to book the car club online. It allows you to find out in real time when the bus is really, truly coming to the bus stop around the corner. And in booking the car club, well, we find residents tend to save something between £800 and £1,000 a year in cash, which is more money to spend on beer by joining car clubs. And this machine, the Shimmy, also is a portal into the community intranet. So it allows people not just to simply monitor and obtain information about when the bins are being emptied and whether the car's available. It also allows them to interact with that. So if people want Calpol at 3 o'clock in the morning for their screaming child, or if they're travelling to Marlborough on Saturday and want to share the cost of the petrol, they can post a note. This is not the internet, this is the intranet. This is the online digital version of the parish magazine. And we think it has a future. In fact, we've now, thanks to Luke, put together a recipe book for recipes based on the fruit and the food that we grow on the site, so that community residents pick and then cook what they have available to them. And the reason I'm mentioning this, the reason I'm so excited about this, is that this book of recipes, which we're going to post on the Shimmy, which is also printed, is nominated for a Landscape Award at the Landscape Institute Awards next week. I don't know if we'll win, but I think it's the first time a book has won an award for landscape. It synthesises, I think, these ideas of green infrastructure, community technology, and the edible landscape, which is dear to all of us. So fruity streets forever, I say. Thank you.
Well, that was a very wide-ranging discussion of some of the things that you might want to do and possibly should be doing. Do I have any questions to any of our panelists? You can ask general questions and I'll ask all of them to answer, or you can ask a specific panelist and pick up on some of the things that they've said. Do I have any hands? Yes.
Hi, David Seth from Fast Future, just to give my name. I was thinking of reading this book called J.G. Bard, High Rise, and it's got me thinking about the expansion of cities and urban living and putting people into these sort of expanding, high-rise buildings. How do we create social cohesion? Because in the book it obviously breaks down and they all attack each other. So how do we create a human urban environment when populations are going up? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and if anyone does want to make a contribution, if they could say their name and where they work, that would be great. So who would like to tackle that first? Jeff, would you like to?
Well, there's been 40, 50 years of attempts to answer your question, and I think high-rise clearly does work very well for some people at some points in their life and absolutely disastrously for other people at other points of their life, and it's just unfortunate that most of the people put into high-rises happen to fit the second category and not the first over many decades. That's slightly less the case now. I'm in a way intrigued, though, by how some of the things which have been discussed here are partly the answer to the limitations of the physical environment where people live behind their door. And maybe just give two examples which build on what Alex said, and I don't know if we can access the web as we talk. So one is Buzzcar, which is the most recent sort of car pooling platform. You can put your car into it when you're not using it, someone else can rent your car and drive it, and it has sort of made the breakthrough in terms of thousands of members, mainly in continental Europe, not yet the UK, which none of the other ones have done. And therefore you will have much less need to own certainly a second car, probably not a first car either. And what's interesting with all of these collaborative consumption platforms is they force you also to deal with another human being, and often you get to know them. And a little one which we're involved in is in South London called Bookshare, where instead of a library containing lots of books, you put all the libraries on your shelves online so your neighbours can borrow them from you and come and visit you. Very, very simple idea. The same is happening with drills, with apples. In fact, a collaborative consumption of apples. Some people have far too many apples, some have far too few. Very, very simple. And the other, again, is what Alec mentioned. If you haven't seen it already, what's being done by one of our partner organisations in Bilbao is the Hirico project, which is for a Boris bike style rentable car which you can fold up. The engine is actually in the wheel of the car, not separate. What's interesting about that project, technically it's quite challenging, but it requires you to bring together the city planners, new pricing mechanisms, new data systems to track where the cars are, and a quite different pattern of behaviour from citizens who've never rented a car for 20 minutes before in their life. Hong Kong looks likely to copy Bilbao, and I think we're going to see many of these things, these experiments, which are not just experiments in urban technology. In some ways it's the way in which they change the patterns of daily life, probably more interesting even than the hardware.
Good night. One comment. I mean, I absolutely agree with all of that. But I spend a lot of time in Manhattan. I have an apartment down the wrong end of Park Avenue. And I would observe something that New York does very well. I mean, people live in high-rise apartments. I mean, there's nothing else but high-rise. But New York is a community, and it's filled with villages, so you really know the place. And what New York manages to do in all of its area of Manhattan, apart from the very south, really where Wall Street is, which is a bit of an activity ghetto, a bit like Docklands. I think it's appalling that Docklands is an activity ghetto. All of the rest of Manhattan, on every corner, there's a grocery store. The restaurants everywhere, there's community sort of living everywhere. I mean, it's all mixed up, and those people have lived in high-rise apartments all their lives. I mean, but that is one of the things you notice, and it's death to the thing when you just have an application ghetto, as I call it, where everybody's just got office buildings and they just go to work there, they just don't live there.
Yeah, I think lots of high-rise works really well. As Jeff said, it's about whether the people in it want to be in high-rise and want to live their lives in high-rise, and what's around it, what's the opportunity, and how does the community work, and how is the allocation of the flats worked. We put some very, very mistakenly put some people into high-rise who couldn't manage in high-rise and didn't have the resources to manage that situation well. I suppose I slightly worry about the digital divide, because there are still an awful lot of people not engaged with technology, and I'm slightly worried about this vision of a world where everything works through technology, because I think although it can bring people together, it can also be very exclusive of those who aren't yet in the club. I mean, we had a great, I thought, idea at Peabody of digivans, which was a way of actually bringing technology to people who could then together learn how to use it, whether they were young or whether they were old. And again, a way of bringing people together in their community to get to know each other. I think the other point I'd make is that quite often one of the real problems of high-rise is disempowerment and inability to control anything in one's environment. And that's really about how it's managed, and how much the ownership is with the community and how much it's external from the community. And that's as true really of absent landlords letting out private rented property as it is of social landlords who maybe don't enable communities to be in charge of their own lives.
Lack of control must be something that you're obviously tackling, because if you're renting, you don't feel like you have any control.
Indeed, which is why it's very important, I think, to break down the boundaries between private ownership and rental, because actually in a community, people are mixed together, and the current taste is sensibly to mix it up and to pepper social housing amongst private owners. So when you do that, of course, it creates all kinds of management issues, but provided that you take a holistic view, it's possible to control the car. And it's very important to give people a sense of ownership, and indeed ownership wherever you can, in the way of public well. I've just come back from Christchurch in New Zealand, to answer your question about high-rise, which had a very high-rise centre, albeit in a business district, which was entirely sterile, and surrounded by one or two bits of old town, and then enormous swathes of suburbs. And what's interesting about Christchurch is that there have been 106,000 suggestions from the local community about what should happen after the earthquake in terms of rebuilding that city centre. And pretty clearly, the people have asked for development which doesn't exceed 7 stories, for development which is mixed, which is highly sustainable, and which puts relatively high density family housing in amongst flats, retail, offices, business, around the river that runs through the centre of the city. So there is a clear mandate there, which I suspect may be echoed in other places when communities are asked what they want.
Anybody else? Any other questions? Yes, we've got 2. One down here at the front. You can say who you are.
Ian Ritchie. It's an observation which relates to what the speakers have been addressing, which is a change of values. From, instead of valuing shares, we seem to want to share values. And I grew up to become a professional architect. I don't know how to describe the effective noun for artists in a colony in Metropolitan Wharf, where people like Anish Kapoor were growing up, and they would always pinch your tools. But there was a wonderful sense of collective, because the tools would find themselves back in the cafe in a box. And I think that when you have a sense of poverty, not of ideas, but you're actually in a sea of autocrats and self-centered people, ambitious, but actually researchers, you do get a sense of community by just obligation almost. And I think the balance between the sort of the wealth factor of certain communities who own or those that rent, when you get a sort of connection of people who are renting alone, who don't have too much money, and I suspect that we could learn an awful lot from that sort of like Western version, if you like, of some of the slums and the districts we talk about in other parts of the world.
Thank you. Before I ask anyone to respond to that, I'd like to say the other question. Who you you are.
Malcolm Smith from Arup. It kind of builds on Ian's point. I'd be intrigued to hear your view. You know, we live in the United Kingdom, one of the kind of resource-rich environments of the world. And a few months ago, we saw our cities being torn apart in an extraordinary way, repeated, gathering momentum through the use of the media that you kind of rightly kind of put forward as a utopia and kind of, you know, positive dimension. We saw a dimension of urbanity in our cities, in some of those poor areas, and it'd be interesting to, you know, our futures in a society that I think is polarising, to hear your views on when we live in these developed cities and the resources that we have available, and yet we see kind of this extraordinary event in our urbanities. How the panel would respond to that.
Let me kick off on those two. The first, several people have mentioned isolation. There's about 500,000 pensioners in this country spend Christmas on their own. We did some research a couple of years ago. About 7 million people said they were severely disconnected. They went through long periods of literally talking to nobody, living on their own behind the door. And I think this is going to become more and more part of this debate. How do you not just have a pleasant building with a good flat screen TV and the smart energy meter, but actually connection with others? When you talk to some typical people in their 60s and 70s, many would like different housing models, maybe sharing housing with 5 or 6 other people, some shared services, perhaps some medical support. There is still almost no provision of what people say they need, and that's not just true in this country. There is a lot of interesting innovation around the non-physical ways of solving these problems. So there's a number of projects essentially using Facebook-type technology to surround a vulnerable older person with a circle of support. So their family, their friends, their neighbours, the doctor, social worker coordinate who's going to visit, who's going to cook their meal, who's going to remind on the prescriptions. But these are still very small scale. Again, they're not designed into any of our urban plans, and it's not quite clear who owns the job of funding them. All of this, I think, is going to become much more central to the urban agenda. And one other little example, just from a week ago, of change of spirit comes from the other side of the world, from the city of Seoul, which has done as much development as anywhere on earth, enormous concrete development in the last 10 or 20 years. Some great things like the Cheonggyechong River through the middle of Seoul. But last week they elected as their new mayor someone who's an old friend of mine, who was standing as the candidate really for the opposite of that tradition. He was the civil society candidate and said, let's stop building ever more concrete bridges and high-rises and so on. Let's create a city, and this goes to your question. Seoul has not had riots, but the people didn't feel they owned or had taken any part in the shaping of the city. It had been done to them by big developers, big Hyundai concrete and so on, you know, quite efficiently, but in ways they felt no ownership of, no connection. And he got a landslide victory which shocked the mainstream parties, but it was a sign of a shift of values, which I suspect we'll see similar patterns in other cities, and Seoul happens to be the most digitally connected city on earth as well. So it's one to watch for other aspects of our future. And some of those technologies, as Pam said, have been isolating in reality. And all the innovation has gone into very individualised versions of the uses of technologies, and now they want to shift that as well to technologies which promote conviviality.
Yeah, the technology. The reason why we invested in the Shimmy and developed that product was in order to promote sociability. It's a piece of technology which is not isolating, but which is socialising. And I'm interested by your point, Ian, that you suggest that it might be poverty that brought you into the enforced culture of sharing. I think there are a great number of people living in all kinds of housing and accommodation in Britain and the UK feel rather poor. And whatever we can do to save money, whether it's by joining a car club or by sharing power tools or simply making some kind of changes to the way that we heat and maintain our buildings, is developed to be wished. And I think many people would, regardless of whether they're renting or owning, feel the need to engage and want that. And I think there was also a great deal of research which has established that those people who know a minimum number of neighbours, maybe 7 or 10, feel better for it. And to address the earlier point about the terrible looting that we saw earlier in the year seems to me a tremendous appealing connection between the idea of materialism, consumption, and a rather contained and selfish lifestyle on the one side, and on the other, this kind of rather old-fashioned, pre-war notion of a shared life, and one which is rooted in community and respect for other people, all ages, backgrounds, all living together in one place, which is how we used to live. Promotes a sense of well-being that tends to dampen that enthusiasm for the material.
Can I ask you, Pam, just before you come in, Ali, just develop that point around developers themselves. You must have come across a lot who want a big return on their money. They want to put in a high density. We've got people questioning here who've sent in their questions over the web. How do we manage the relationship between housing quality and density? This is something you must have seen in your past.
Well, yes. I mean, I'm not sure that high density always means highest values for developers. I mean, it's sometimes been something that they've been moved towards because that's what's required in terms of housing numbers. Sometimes it can, of course. I think what I wanted to say to link housing quality to what we're now talking about was to really emphasise the point that Malcolm made about sharing values. Because I think what developers are now the best developers are now trying to do is make sure they understand the values of the communities that they're trying to work in. They understand what it is that the market is looking for, and they create something which works for that community. And with localised planning, that's going to have to be the way forward, because the community simply won't allow it. Now, we're all struggling with what the national policy framework means, but what the community has the opportunity of being is really involved in creating developments. And I was down in Hastings again with the Design Council earlier last week, talking with the local authority about how they could generate community engagement in their planning, so that before you got anywhere near planning applications, developers were involved in discussing how it would work as a community, not just how individual houses would get built, but how the whole community would work and how it would work for the next 10, 20 years to create community value. Developers, I think, have begun to understand that long-term value needs to be created if communities are going to accept that developments are a good thing and play to their own agendas, and that's got to happen if they're going to be owned. Otherwise we see alienation and we see more than one community, and I think possibly in relation to the rights, what we were saying was, well, I'm looking after my community, I don't care about your community because your community doesn't seem to care about me. And that's, I think, something which is very challenging and requires us to look at the values of the individuals. I mean, I particularly wanted to mention Slough, because I don't know whether anybody saw it, but there was an interesting programme on how to create happiness in Slough a couple of years ago. Friendly bombs and all that not being terribly conducive to happiness. And I was always struck by the fact that one of the first things that the people who were involved in that experiment were asked to do was to get a plant and grow it. So I think the fruity streets that Kevin is creating is a real route towards creating communities that have shared values. And allotments, we know at the moment, maybe are the equivalent of Ian's artistic communities working together. I think allotments are a really great way of people being brought together who've never known their neighbours, but are now working together to create something that works. And if anyone can tell me how to get rid of my remaining apples, I'd be delighted.
Well, I've always perceived developers to be quite a barrier to all the changes that you've all been discussing, because they believe that people are quite conservative. They just want their rabbit hutch with a little portico over the doorway to live on Brookside Close, and that's the kind of sum total of their need, with a garage for their car, because they don't want to give up their car. And that you've got to overcome that with developers all the time, because they perceive that that's what your average family is concerned with.
Well, it's not about perception, it's about realities in the marketplace. It is true. Consumers in the house building world do not drive good consumption. We accept much less quality than we could argue for and buy. And I think all of the work that organisations like Kevin's and all of the best house builders and developers, and they are two different industries with very different objectives and values, but the best of them are trying to create value. And if we can get people to understand that eco homes have value, help them to live more cost effectively, help them to have ways of living which work better for them, then we'll all be trying to have shared values. The problem is that actually many consumers buy what's there and are not terribly critical about it, and I'm afraid if you can make money that way, there are people quite happy to do that. But there are also many house builders, I believe now, who are trying to create value that will generate better profit. Because after all, they're not going to do it for the good of their souls, they're doing it for profit. But I think there can be profit if we can help people to understand how higher quality and a more sustainable approach to living can actually benefit their pockets as well.
I think it's too difficult to keep people's feet to the fire. I mean, the large developers, I live in a large development that I moved into with the expectation there were going to be 6 or 8 restaurants, there was going to be gyms and all sorts of things. It just hasn't been delivered. And these people can go and change their plans, and we have an association that tries to work to resist this, but it's an uphill battle. Major legal issues, you have to have money to do this. I think government's got to really think about these things. Also, the whole character of the UK, if you think about it, and England has changed over the last few years, and the government just goes ahead with these things. Look at the number of pubs that are closing, and the pub was the place where single people and old people could wander down to the pub. And, I don't want to list all the obvious things that have stopped that, but these pubs have been closed all over the place. And it's all too sort of openly commercial. We should have, this is where I want some social science advisors in government to say, beware, you're changing the whole character of people's lives, by sort of cavalierly giving them these great efficient things. I mean, my comments about mobility is that I think mobility is a universal thing to help people to move around and do these things. I mean, we've got this odd business now. You can't go to the pub because you can't drive. Well, why were you driving your own car anyway? I mean, there should be a better system to get to the pub, but then maybe alcohol's so bad. You should all go home. And we can't, you're not allowed to watch television either, so you then have to go to cold bath and get paid.
Yeah, well, even if there isn't a pub, there are other things to go and do, aren't there? You need transport to get there. Yes, we've got some more hands. Yes, in the middle there. You can say who you are and where you're from.
Well, I'm a social scientist. I'm Fran Tonkis from the LSE Cities programme, and I'm very encouraged by everyone on the panel's call for a discipline that works across professional boundaries, because that's exactly what we're about. A comment and a question. I was struck that all of the panellists came up with scenarios that were good for individuals and households. You get to work more efficiently, you get a nice house with an apple tree, you get qualifications and so on. But also good for the city in a more collective sense, giving people a sense of a share in something which they don't actually own. My question then is the downside of those scenarios. How do you see the major obstacles or the major threats to this kind of vision of urban futures? Because as Alex said, we kind of know what is possible. And we know to a degree what people want or what makes them happy, if you will. But we need to know what we're up against. So what do you see as the risks to these visions?
Okay, we should go to the parliamentarian first.
It's the vested interest of business very often. It's also that we've got to recognise where we are. I mean, if I look at transport, I learned something very interesting. We could increase the throughput of the underground just by installing an efficient signalling system. I don't know whether anybody was on the Victoria line with me tonight, but you have that experience too, because the signals were out in Finsbury Park, and that was the end of the Victoria line. Some of our signalling systems, would you believe it, were built in 1922 and are still operating in their original state. To get these things to go, it's very difficult because it's a matter of organising collaboration. I mean, it's one thing that the technology strategy board's trying to do, is get people together and say, why don't we all work together? In transport, it's the roads, the rail, and marine. If we airline people won't even talk to us, however, that's another split. It's a matter of feeling that we're all with one aim. I think there's progress is being made, but that's the problem in my mind. Everybody's down their own channel and they have their own profit-making techniques, and initially those cross-pollination doesn't make any profit. You've got to do a bit of work on it before it yields.
Jeff, you've sat next to prime ministers and advised. What kind of barriers do you see?
Well, I think it's a very good question. Let me just give 3 examples. One is Tottenham. I'm a long-standing resident of Tottenham, where the riots began in summer. And in fact, over the last few years, Tottenham's been a very good example of community development and coping with enormous inflows of migrants, very creative ways of getting different communities to know each other, to interact, to cook meals for each other. The transformation of Broadwater Farm from really a nightmare 30 years ago to a pretty pleasant place to live has been good. What happened? Well, the continuous churn of people is very destabilising for any community, and you add on to that the sharp increase in youth unemployment and hopelessness, and a lot of it's fallen apart. So I think often progress is then followed by retreat. Another example of the difficulties is about happiness. I was involved in launching this slightly odd organisation, Action for Happiness, earlier this year. We have 20,000 members, groups all over the country, using the often very simple methods of improving happiness in your life, in your workplace, in your school, in your street. They don't cost very much money, they're dead straightforward, but always those are competing with very powerful messages to do other things, which often work against happiness. And so it's a struggle. And the final example is about pubs. So the last 10 years, lots of pubs, like some post offices, have been going out of business, not just in rural areas, but in cities as well. There is, I think, now quite a creative response in many places, turning them into cooperatives, binding in a different ownership model, as it were, to solve the problems of the business model, which is unsustainable. And there are foundations now helping this happen, but it does require quite a lot of sort of strength of social organisation to get this to happen, which turns out to be easier in rural areas actually than many cities.
Well, I'm a shareholder in my local shop, so I completely agree with that. And it was a struggle, and it brought the whole community together when we thought the post office and shop, which was the only shop in our village, was going to close. And I think one of the most exciting ideas I heard of was the Pub the Hub, which I think was Prince Charles's idea about 10 years ago, that pubs were closing and have been closing for as long as I can remember. And the pub, in a rural community particularly, but why not in towns as well, could become the post office and the vegetable shop, and indeed all of those surplus apples could sit outside it and people could take them and make their delicious things with it. So I think how you bring communities together is one of the key challenges, and one of the barriers is that we are all head down in our own worlds. And I think professionally, as Jeff said, everyone operates in silos. And I think particularly when there are problems, institutional change, cuts in support, that makes silos draw in and wait for the status quo to return. And it's really hard to get people up out of their defensive boxes and into creative thinking about how we don't return to the status quo. We'll try and do something different and new and together. So I think that is always going to be a bit of a challenge, but as Alex said, getting collaborative working is the answer to it, and it's the answer to most questions actually.
Kevin.
One of the things that interests us in my business is the idea of being able to repeat what we do. That is, unlike other developers, not build and bugger off, but work with local housing associations and communities and stay in one place and do more than one development. And it, as it were, through redensifying city and town centres, creating effectively green infrastructure, like a sort of connective tissue through existing communities that, for example, allows existing residents in a place who might not benefit from a car club or a community kitchen garden or allotment to actually take advantage of stuff that we're putting in for new residents and join the car club. And it's actually then when you get critical mass in those communities that things really start to take off and work. The impediments to that kind of development are highways departments, utility companies, and very possibly the new planning framework. So the jury's still out about it. I don't think it's a developer's charter, that's for sure. I don't think it's necessarily a community charter either, and it's woefully lacking in detail that helps us in any way point towards how we as developers might work with communities and how those communities might be empowered through the local process. It sets out some wonderful ambitions, but it is not clear as to how those communities are empowered. It is not clear at all as to how local authorities are going to produce plans of merit, and it is absolutely opaque as to where the central government guidance comes from in terms of design standards for local authorities as well. So I wish it were better than it is.
Right, well, thank you for the last question. All I would say is we are trying to remain positive here. We're trying to come up with some ideas. So while we've all got our criticisms of the current system, and I have many myself, usually to do with money and tax and the way the whole property business runs itself. But I think we should focus our attention on looking at some of the things we think should be happening, even with the restrictions that we know exist because of government cuts and all that sort of stuff. So can I take some more questions? Yes, I'm heading from the right-hand side over here.
Sarah Buck from the Ove Arup Foundation. I'm off to Bhutan shortly, and they have a gross national happiness index, so perhaps I'll report back after that. But my question relates to generations. In this country, we have an ageing population, and I feel we have going towards a disconnected youth population. So the young people finding it very difficult to get work at the moment. They're finding it difficult to go to university, or they will be because of fees. So the younger finding it difficult. I think the older finding it difficult. Healthcare is difficult with the cuts. So my question relates to how do you make the connection between the young, the old, and the people that we've mainly been talking about tonight, who the sort of the middle sector, the working population. How do you make the connection between those generations?
Okay, can I take another question? Yes, back there.
Hi there, Rachel Ferguson. I'm a practising and studying town planner. Just in view of the comment you made, Kevin, about planning reforms, I was wondering what you thought about neighbourhood planning and the potential it leads to community empowerment, and whether people really are going to get more of a say, and if not, how you think the framework or the localism bill can be widened to give the community real empowerment.
Okay, I'm not going to start with you, Kevin. I'm going to go to Jeff. So if we've got these generations, we often characterise the older groups as a problem, but obviously that's just a fact of the way Western societies are developing. We've got the highest number of single-parent families in Britain, in Europe. 20% of all families are single-parent families. We've got lots of old people. We've got young people who can't afford things. Are these a problem, or are these something that we can take and say, right, well, you're a community that we can look at and do things for?
Well, in a way, it's such a big question, I'm not quite sure where to start. And even our categories, I think, will have to evolve. I mean, what is youth nowadays, when you probably live with your parents till you're 30, as increasing numbers do? What is old age? It's a number of very different stages of life, from the more active, often people more active now in their 60s than in their 50s, to the significantly less active. I think it's very important to avoid the extremes. What happened in Leeds around student accommodation, where whole areas of the city were becoming solely dominated by one age group and then were completely vacated in the... some I think was right when the council tried to use planning and other powers to reverse that and have more mixing. At the other end, I would not like to see the UK go the way of Florida, or perhaps more Torbays and so on, where you have almost sort of mono-generational populations. As a matter of principle, I think it's healthy to have, as you were implying, a reasonable amount of mixing. But I think you then have to go to the fine grain of how institutions work and daily life is organised. I'll just give one very small example of that. I've been involved in setting up a network of new schools, which it's about 8 open this year, about 20 next year, called studio schools for 14 to 19-year-olds, with most of the curriculum done through real-life projects rather than just classroom pedagogy. But part of the principle there is the daily life of the school, as a matter of course, brings in businesses, charities, and people of all ages, not just the parents, much as parents don't usually come into the school at all. We found that delivers better academic results, but also a very different kind of cultivation of character amongst young people, and therefore much more ease in working in teams, in dealing with adults and getting things done. I would like to see all schools operate much more like studio schools than like many do at the moment. Perhaps as one other example is we're just starting a programme on supporting hyper-local media platforms. There are already quite a lot of these around the world, which create at the level of the neighbourhood essentially a website on which you get local news, you do your Apple sharing, your emergencies, etc. But what interests me is when you also add on to those new roles. So you have someone who is in charge of sort of nature watching or bird watching or looking out for things, and you create new roles both for older people with time and for children in school to start filling up the Google Maps with stuff going on. I'm talking very telegraphically, but I think we need to sort of decompose your question to lots and lots of specifics rather than sweeping generalisations.
Alec, are you part of the problem in your age group, or are you part of the solution?
I'm nothing really to add here. I'm very troubled by this, but everywhere I am in the world, and I live quite a lot overseas in the States, and I've been in Australia quite a bit. I mean, it's an endless problem. This separation of the young from the old, and you can just observe a few communities. I was in Melbourne for a month. Melbourne is a huge city. I mean, you talk about Christchurch and sprawling suburbs. There's 5 million people almost in Melbourne now. It'd be bigger than any city but this one we're sitting in Britain. The Chinese have arrived in quite a big way. They do this better somehow. At least my observation of that in places. I mean, they've got restaurants in the suburbs of Melbourne now that look like the great big restaurants in Hong Kong. But when you go there, there's a big tables. Most of the tables are 12, 14. And grandma and grandpa are there, and the kids are running around, and they seem to be able to hold the family together. Whereas in our modern high-speed life, we're all we've got kids all over the place, and it's not like that anymore. And so all the old people sort of ship themselves off to a comfortable place, and Florida, I don't know what we do about that. I really don't, because I think it's quite naive to dream about the sort of recreating somehow the village and bringing everybody back together. And it's something that troubles me a lot. I don't have a solution. I do feel terribly sorry for these young people who can't get jobs now. I think we've got to readjust our society to, even if these have got to be jobs that are very lowly paid or something, you mustn't leave people developing a sense of real uselessness.
I mean, obviously there's old people own a lot of the assets. They could reintegrate themselves. They have the power to do so. They have means. A lot of people have means.
A lot of people do, and a lot of people don't. So I wanted to come from the other end, actually, about the people who don't, because I think one of the reasons that we have not such strong family networks is that we have broken up family networks by the way in which we've allocated housing through the social housing sector for the last 2 decades, if not more. And when I was chair of Peabody, one of the biggest demands of our tenants was that they should be able to have tenancies for their sons and daughters to keep family networks together. And that's not been possible since the Housing Act, which put all allocations based on need. And I do think, actually, that that's one of the changes that we need to get at a local level. We need to have flexibility. The reason was it was exclusive, and communities could keep people out who they didn't want, and there are all sorts of obvious reasons why that was difficult. But I think we've gone too far the other way. We've broken up family networks that could be hugely important in creating the cement of communities that care about each other and look out for each other. So I think actually one thing I would like, and really wanted at Peabody, was the ability to strengthen family networks in allocating social housing, and it links to the point about making sure that the right people are in the right housing. I don't think that means that you try and force old people to move out of houses that are too big for them, because most old people like to have their grandchildren to come and stay. We haven't got enough housing. That's a different problem altogether. But one of the things for me is community is created from family networks as well as neighbours, and we need to be encouraging both. Volunteering, I think, is a really important answer to a very small part of your question. Not many old people want the most alienated youth turning up on their doorstep, but actually there are large numbers of young people who can get really useful experience, which is very valuable when they then look for work. And that needs to be organised somehow, whether it's organised by the community or by organisations trying to bring people together. I think there is a lot of really good work going on like that. And volunteering, you don't have to be poor and old to be really pleased to have a young person show up on your doorstep and spend some time with you. There are a lot of very lonely, very rich people too. Just a word about neighbourhood planning. I understand all the points that Kevin made about the new planning framework, and we're all trying to work out how it can work. But there are some good things in there. There are some hugely welcome objectives in there, and frankly the simplification itself is welcome. So we need to help work out what it means. And I think there are mechanisms, and empowerment is not empowerment if you're given rights but nobody helps you to use them. So communities will need support to be able to produce good neighbourhood plans. They need to work with the local authorities, and we have some networks. CABE was responsible for design review, and there is a huge network now of affiliates who help local authorities across the UK to work on community planning. We're going to need to work out how we do that in future. We'd like to see that as a key part of the national policy framework, that there is a mechanism by which we mediate what good design is. And frankly, I think we're going to have one. Otherwise, every community that doesn't want development is going to be taking the developers to judicial review and saying that it's obviously poor quality. And I think that's a good enough reason for us to get an answer to this problem.
Thank you, Kevin. Kevin, I realise you've got a train to catch, so you might dash out mid-sentence, but if you could...
I'm going to try and answer both of those questions at the same time and say that up until now developers have been building schemes which are monocultural, and in order to create a very simple, straightforward, healthy communities, it's important that we provide for people of all ages and abilities in schemes, and that those schemes remain as flexible as possible, so that allows people to grow older and move within the same scheme down the road from a 4-bedroom to a 2-bedroom home. How radical is that idea? And instead of doing stay where they are. And for that matter, even on schemes, have the opportunity of being able to use a community-based hostel or home that's available, say one home for every 200, which is available for rent on an occasional use for guests, so that you can continue to live in a relatively small unit but still welcome family to stay at the same time. It's answered one of the earlier issues, this issue about what developers are doing and how the market is reacting at the moment. The old model, if not dead, is on life support. Development companies tend to be more focused towards their shareholders than towards communities. And the future model, I do see as being very much rooted in the relationship between developer, community, housing association as the long-term broker and long-term representative, if you like, the guardian of the scheme, and residents. And it is through the agency of all of those together that you create, monitor, and help flourish communities in the long term. You can't do this simply by building and disappearing.
Well, that's a great note to end on, I'm afraid. We're now drawing our discussion to a close. Because, as I mentioned at the beginning, this has all been filmed, it's something that you can take off our website. It's something that you can show people. It's free, you can take it. I think there's a whole version, there's an edited version, it's going to be sliced and diced, lots of ways for you to use in any way you see fit to show people. I I think that we've obviously had some great ideas. My own personal ones are for a change in tax rules, governing the way we tax land. I think the way we don't tax land means that it encourages people to speculate on land, that we are up against developers who are constantly making big bets, and that's something that our tax system encourages, and that if we could make some changes there, that would calm the situation down. People could plan longer term. They would not see it as something as a get-rich-quick scheme. It's something that they would be involved in much more longer-term planning, and I think that's also an essential element. But I was very interested to hear all the different ideas, and I hope that one of the things that Arup Foundation wants to do is take these on, for you to get involved, for you to comment, take these films, and come back to the hashtag, make contributions. They're going to pick up on those. They want to foster debate. They want to try and invest. They've got money. They want to put it into helping you actually bring some of these ideas to fruition. So thank you very, very much for coming. And there are now drinks and canapes. Please, as far as I know, our speakers are hanging around. Please come and talk to them. Thank you very much.